The airport was alive with activity, filled with travelers rushing to get through security, checking their watches in a hurry, and standing in long lines to board their flights. Among the crowd, an elderly woman, Margaret Davis, stood calmly. Her silver hair was neatly tucked under a simple hat, and her frail hands grasped a small, worn purse. She held her boarding pass with a slight tremble. Margaret wasn't someone of wealth or status. She was just another passenger in the sea of people, quietly making her way toward the airline counter. With a soft smile, she addressed the young attendant, her voice quiet but polite. "Excuse me, dear, I was told I had a seat in first class." The attendant barely looked up, her fingers clicking away on the keyboard. "Your ticket says economy, ma'am," she responded quickly. "There's no first-class upgrade on your reservation." Margaret hesitated, feeling a pang of disappointment. She hadn't asked for special treatment, simply trusted the promise made earlier. Nearby, a businessman, Henry Wallace, sneered loudly. "Lady, we all paid for first class. You don't get bumped up just because you're nice." A few passengers nodded in agreement, and Margaret lowered her gaze, whispering under her breath, "I understand." Holding tightly to her purse, she moved forward as the attendant waved her on dismissively. As she walked down the narrow corridor to her economy seat, she tried not to let her disappointment show. She squeezed into her spot between two restless passengers, adjusting her hat with quiet dignity. She wouldn't complain, not ever. Once everyone boarded, the intercom crackled to life, cutting through the cabin with a calm, authoritative voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Before we depart, we've had a change in seating arrangements." The passengers exchanged puzzled glances. The captain continued, his tones steady and clear. "Could Mrs. Margaret Davis please make her way to the front of the aircraft?" Margaret froze, unsure she had heard correctly. The flight attendant appeared by her seat, smiling warmly. "Mrs. Davis, the captain would like you to join him in the first-class cabin." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Henry Wallace, who had been mocking Margaret moments before, sat up straighter, his confident smirk replaced by surprise. Slowly, Margaret stood, feeling the eyes of the passengers on her as she made her way toward the front. As she passed through the curtain separating economy from first class, a new world opened before her. Spacious, luxurious seats that seemed miles away from her cramped spot. Then, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Daniel Reed stepped out. He removed his hat respectfully as he looked at Margaret with deep gratitude in his eyes. "Mrs. Davis," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been hoping to meet you for a long time." Margaret frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. "I'm sorry, dear, but do I know you?" The captain smiled gently. "No, ma'am, but you knew my mother." Curiosity filled the cabin as passengers leaned forward. Margaret's eyes widened in recognition. "Your mother?" she asked, puzzled. "Her name was Lily Walker," Captain Reed continued, his tone somber. "When she was young, she was given a second chance because of your kindness." Margaret's mind flashed back decades to a rainy night when she had encountered a young woman, Lily, shivering alone on a park bench. Margaret had approached her, offering help, a warm meal, and a safe place to sleep for the night. She had shared simple yet profound advice with Lily. "When you can, please pass on the kindness to someone else." Captain Reed knelt beside Margaret's seat. "My mother never forgot your kindness. She went back to school, became a teacher, and taught me the importance of paying forward every kindness." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. She had done all of that out of compassion, never expecting recognition. And yet, here she was high above the ground, receiving it in a way she could never have imagined. Standing up, Captain Reed addressed the entire cabin with quiet dignity. "Today, it's my honor to repay the kindness my mother received all those years ago. Mrs. Davis will be our special guest in first class for the remainder of the flight." A hush fell over the passengers. Henry Wallace, who had earlier ridiculed Margaret, shifted in his seat, his cocky demeanor gone. Others who had overlooked Margaret now avoided her gaze in quiet embarrassment. Margaret, overwhelmed, gently shook her head. "Oh, I couldn't possibly." Captain Reed placed his hat into her hands with a gentle smile. My mother would have wanted this. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to accept the kindness extended to her. As she settled into the plush, first-class seat, a warmth spread through the cabin. The passengers who had once dismissed her now regarded her with genuine admiration. Henry, now deeply reflective, cleared his throat, his voice softer. I misjudged you, he admitted sincerely. I was wrong. Margaret smiled kindly. It's never too late to see things differently, dear. A young mother nearby, holding her baby, whispered, I want my daughter to grow up knowing people like you exist. Margaret chuckled softly, her voice seasoned with wisdom. Kindness is everywhere, sweetheart. We just need to open our eyes to it. Moved by a sense of humility, Henry reached into his wallet, scribbled something on a check, and handed it discreetly to the flight attendant. Please, make a donation in Mrs. Davis's honor, he requested, his voice quiet. Margaret wiped a tear from her eye. She didn't seek recognition or comfort. The quiet gratitude of those around her meant more than any praise. As the plane landed, Margaret held the captain's hat in her hands, walking toward the exit. Suddenly, a spontaneous round of applause filled the cabin. The passengers who had barely noticed her before now clapped with respect, not because she demanded it, but because she truly deserved it. Stepping into the terminal, Margaret smiled softly to herself. She understood that kindness never truly disappears. It just finds its way back to us, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. As Margaret stepped into the terminal, a warm smile touched her lips. The applause still echoed in her mind, but it wasn't the recognition that had moved her. It was the simple truth she had always known but never fully embraced. Kindness is a gift that transcends time and circumstances. What had started as an act of compassion years ago had come full circle, showing her that even the smallest gestures can ripple through lives, changing the course of destinies. In that moment, Margaret realized that the world is full of quiet, unseen acts of goodness. Sometimes we just need to be open enough to recognize them. The lives she had touched, even unknowingly, were now a part of her own story. It was no longer about what was given to her in return, but about the connections that kindness wove between strangers. Her small gesture of helping a young woman all those years ago had now blossomed into something far greater than herself. The experience was a reminder that kindness doesn't seek praise or glory. It moves in subtle ways, like a whisper that can travel the distance of a lifetime. The world might seem crowded with noise, often drowned out by cynicism and haste, but the quiet power of kindness has a way of cutting through it all, even when we least expect it. As Margaret walked out of the terminal, her heart was full, not with the applause of others, but with the knowledge that in giving, she had received more than she could have ever imagined. The kindness she had shown was returned in the most unexpected of ways, teaching her that sometimes the smallest acts can leave the deepest marks on the world.